Welcome to Shift. If this is your first time here, we would love it if you would scan this QR code, and if you fill out that Connect card, we'll send you some free Opus coffee. And make sure that you check out the Coffee with Joe option so that you can have that cup of Joe with Joe Smith himself, and you can ask any and all questions that you want or need to know. Our next First Magnitude group is the 19th at 6 p.m. Come hang out, grab some food. You know it's always fun to meet new people, new friends. You can RSVP to the invite in our Facebook virtual campus group, or just show up. 1946, the movie, has hit the road. There are 3 locations in Florida in August, and the closest one is going to be in Jacksonville on August 14th. Tickets are free, but donations are always welcome. Not only will you get to see the movie live, but there's going to be a Q&A afterwards with the film creator Sharon Rocky Roggio and others. So you can scan this QR code or the one on the back wall to get your tickets today. Now it's time for our new series, American Jesus.
It's actually good to be back in person. We had a little impromptu break last week, and so it's good to be back in person, or whether you're joining us online. So how was everybody's week? Was it good? Anything big happening lately? Here, nationally, whatever? Of course, it seems like every week, right? There are big things happening, and not just the stuff that we deal with on a daily basis, but then our overlords continue to bombard us. And this year, it seems like it's just like one thing after another, after another, after another. And personally, I think it's by design. I think that if they barrage us with so much junk that we'll become numb to all of it, that there'll be so many things to care about, that's really difficult to even care about just one thing, right? And then when that happens, like despair kind of creeps in, right? Despair leads to apathy. And then when we become so overwhelmed that we can just no longer care at all, that's when American Jesus empire wins. And so I'd like to I would like to welcome all of you to here in person or online. This is, if you're new, my name is Joe, and this is the first week of a series that we've called American Jesus. And I want to say up front, don't let that title fool you, because this is not going to be a cynical series. I will point out a lot of the hypocrisy that's being perpetrated in the name of Jesus, but then what we're going to do is we're going to dive into what he actually said, actual teachings of Jesus. And so through this, we won't give in to despair. The goal is to not be swallowed by apathy, even though it would be incredibly easy. If we are to create a world that has room for everybody, and I mean every body, then it's going to start in pockets of resistance, just like this, all over the country. And it doesn't begin with despair, it begins with presence, and presence leads to hope. So if you're comfortable, I would like to invite you to close your eyes and to take a few deep cleansing breaths in through the nose and then out through the mouth. Fill your lungs from the bottom to the top. Inhale and exhale. And if you need to, during any point in this exercise, you can always return to your breathing. As you do that, allow your body to relax and your mind to go where it needs to. And gently lay down whatever came before this. And keep whatever is coming next for next. And just focus on now. Focus on your body relaxing, tension flowing downward until it seeps into the floor. What do you need from this gathering? What do you need from me today? Set your intentions for this space. Be aware of the patterns that you notice and how the Spirit speaks through them. Continue to breathe, and as things come to the surface, meet them with love and curiosity, not with judgment. Just slowly, as you begin to return to the room, continue to breathe deeply in and out. Take a few more deep diaphragm breaths, and when you're ready, I invite you to open your eyes. Can I be honest with you? Like uncomfortably honest? Thank you. I am angry and shocked and truthfully scared because of the constant willing away of our rights and what our country is being transformed into by the constant onslaught of the religious right. I don't know if you know this, but what we're experiencing is the culmination of a decades-long plan that started with the Goldwater presidential campaign in 1964. It really began to find its footing with Jerry Falwell and the moral majority in the 80s. And so for those that are using Jesus as a mascot for their own political gain and power, all of this is part of a religious war that has been waging since the late 1970s. And if I'm trying to live a Jesus-centered life, like how do I respond to the things that are happening? Because the way I want to respond is with all kinds of vengeance. Like I want to go straight up Batman on some people's faces, right? Like I've got matches and gasoline, we ride at dawn kind of responses, right? But where does that get us? Like if my response to their political violence is just more violence, then isn't that just that wide path of destruction that Jesus talks about in Matthew 7? In verse 13, he says, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction. And there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it. And Jesus isn't talking about some far off afterlife destruction. He's talking about right now. He's talking about the cycle of that perpetual cycle of violence that we see throughout human history. Every conflict, every political coup, every war, every genocide is on that wide gate path. And it's easy. Many find it, right? It's easy because we're able to treat people without worrying about how we treat people. And we do this, like maybe not on that scale, but we do this in the way that we treat those that we disagree with. And social media makes it so much worse, because I want to type all my responses in capitals, right? I just want to hit that caps lock and type it all the exclamation points, right? Because I want to belittle you and I want everybody to see it happening, right? And I want to participate in that us versus them culture. Do you know how easy it would be to grow Shift if we did that? It would be incredibly easy. And it would feel so good until it didn't. And then when it stopped feeling good, we would look up and all we would see are just ashes, nothing left except destruction. This past week, I got to interview a woman by the name of Dr. Mish Van Essen for the Shift Happens podcast. Dr. Van Essen is an intersectional theologian, and intersectional theology deals with the human stories that we see in the Bible. Oftentimes, those human experiences get erased when we read them, especially if you're from that majority culture. She pointed out the story of the Ethiopian servant in a book called Acts in chapter 8 to get baptized. And we read that as a story of redemption. And it can be that, but if we don't humanize the story, if we don't realize that this story is about a person, we just erase everything that person was. Because yes, that person was had a position of some prominence, but they were from a conquered region and they were a eunuch, which meant that probably was forced upon them. And so anything that they had achieved came at a great cost, a lot of pain and a lot of heartache. And intersectional theology helps us see all the complex humanity present within the stories. And during what was an incredibly interesting conversation that I had with her, she said something that kind of took me aback. It shocked me a little bit. She said that she doesn't believe that Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our country. She thinks it's polarization. And yes, Christian nationalism is an existential threat to our democracy. But if we don't learn how to interact with one another, if we don't learn how to be okay with ambiguity, if we don't learn to sit with something that's uncomfortable, if we continue to exist just within our echo chambers, all of this will end with tragedy. And I've been thinking about that ever since. Like, if we don't learn to sit with each other, if we don't learn how to create a legitimate third way, if we don't have spaces for people to learn and grow, then all I fear is just destruction. And a quick plug, I encourage you to listen to her episode that is live on Wednesday. In our increasingly polarized culture, then how do we choose love? And how do we do it in a healthy way? Like, not putting ourselves in toxic, abusive, or harmful relationships, but loving in a way that is good for us and for those that we disagree with. There's a well-known chapter in a letter called John that I think shows us our first steps towards a healing in our very fractured world. And before we jump into this, I just need to say that I think that Jesus is a brilliant storyteller and deeply understood the human condition in ways that he doesn't get enough credit for. Because we skip right past his humanity into the divine, and we're lesser for it. So if you've heard this passage before, it's in John 15. Many of you have. I need you to listen to it with new ears. So it's John 15, starting with verse 1. I'm going to read a chunk and then we'll talk about it. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I've spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into fire, and burned. Then we're going to skip down to verse 10. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. This whole passage, Jesus is inviting us into presence. And he does so by using the concrete, because the pathway to the spiritual is always the concrete, and everything spiritual can only be understood in metaphor. And so Jesus uses something that they all know, agriculture, to show them the eternal presence that they're being invited into. Now, notice right away that Jesus says that the vine grower prunes branches in him that don't produce fruit. And I find it fascinating that Jesus himself admits that he is still learning and still growing, that he is still doing the internal work that he calls us to. If you skip past Jesus's humanity, you will always get a lesser understanding of his divinity. And Jesus in this passage does a lot of talking about pruning and cutting off and burning. And if you've spent any time in the evangelical church, then no doubt that you have heard this passage being used in a way to talk about hell. Because the church loves to use every chance it can to talk about hell and create that fear within you. Because if you're fearful, you're easier to manipulate. However, Jesus is talking in metaphor. I hate yard work. I hate yard work in the summer. When it's nice that I don't mind it so much. But right now, it's stupid. It's just too freaking hot to spend hours outside on plants. All right. And now that I'm older, let me back that up. Now that I'm wiser, I have this whole get up that I will put on if I'm going to be in the sun that long, right? Like, I've got a particular pair of pants that I wear. I've got my outdoor working shoes. I have those rash guards, I'm talking about, those long sleeve t-shirts that like breathe really well. And then I have this big brimmed floppy hat that covers my head and my neck. So it's a sight. Yeah, it's a sight. I'm sure there's ones around somewhere. A- And because I hate doing it, it usually means that by the time I do it, like it really needs doing, right? Like it really needs getting done. And that means that the yard needs mowing, there's got to be weed eating. And then several times a year, the bushes have gone out of control, grown out of control, and I've got to cut those things. I got to trim them first. So I'll trim everything first. I'll trim all the bushes first and just let those limbs just fall. And then I'll weed eat everything. And then with my mower, I will mow over that, right? And it will either mulch it to the point that it's just beneficial to the grass, right? Or it gets sucked up into the bag on the back of on the mower. You know what I don't do? I don't see the out of control, overgrown limbs and then torture the bush for all of eternity because the limbs I had to cut off, right? Jesus isn't talking about anything remotely close to hell. He's using metaphor. What he's talking about is all those parts within us entangled with our ego that need to be pruned for us to live in healthy ways. In his book, The Naked Now, Christian mystic and priest Richard Rohr says this: the ego is the unobserved self. He goes on to say, going to the next one, ego is not bad. It's just what takes over when you do not see truthfully and completely. And Jesus had the ability to take a step back and truthfully observe himself. He was constantly learning, constantly growing. And before anybody gets too upset with that, let me encourage you again to not skip past his humanity. In fact, we see examples of his learning and growing in real time. In the letter called Matthew, and Matthew's account of Jesus' life, in chapter 15, Jesus encounters a Canaanite woman, and she's asking for her daughter to be healed. And the text says, you can go read it, the text says that Jesus ignored her. She's begging for her daughter's life, and Jesus ignores her. And she doesn't shut up. She won't stop. And as a matter of fact, it gets to the point where the disciples are like, dude, Jesus, do something. She won't shut up. Verse 24, this is what Jesus says. He refused, telling them, I've got my hands full dealing with the lost sheep of Israel. He's like, tough. I'm too busy. Sorry. And she finally gets in front of him. Like she makes her way and she gets in front of him. She falls down. She's begging him for help. And his response is nothing short of cruel. Verse 26. He says, it's not right to take bread out of children's mouths and throw it to the dogs. Now, there have been a lot of explanations about this passage, and you can renegotiate this all you want, but it's not kind. This is not a kind response. Her response, though, is brilliant and helps Jesus see something that he hadn't before. She says that even dogs get scraps from the master's table, and you can almost see the light bulb. You can almost see the understanding come to Jesus in verse 28 as he says, oh, woman. You can hear it. Oh, woman, your faith is something else. What you want is what you get. And right then her daughter became well. Jesus's ability to observe his own ego allowed him to grow more and more into the Christ. He models for us what it means to have branches pruned so that more fruit can grow. And only those who refuse that process are cut off. Not because the vine grower does the cutting, but because they refuse to observe their ego. They allow that ego to go unchecked. Notice all throughout the Jesus stories, Jesus is never upset. He's never mad at sinners, right? Quote unquote sinners. He is always upset with those that pretend that they're not. And he calls them things like hypocrites and actors. And it's a pattern that happens repeatedly over and over through the Jesus accounts. And it happens so often because religion does a poor job of seeing the shadow truthfully. And it instead projects that shadow self onto others. It allows people within the religion to go on unchecked in their racism, in their bigotry, in their misogyny, in their xenophobia, and their homophobia. This unchecked and unobserved ego is the reason why we see the evangelical church screaming about groomers and pedophiles, and yet saying nothing about a president who has recently been named in Jeffrey Epstein's little black book. In the call logs repeatedly, confirming massage appointments. Call logs, flight logs, been photographed with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell numerous times. And on the other side, let's not forget Bill Clinton as well. It's why drag queens and trans people are the predators with no evidence of that accusation, but not the pastors that are arrested almost daily for sexual abuse of children. An unobserved ego allows the person to commit evil while believing it to be good. You want to know why the American evangelical church is dying? Unchecked and unobserved egos. We are seeing in real time the cutting off of that branch. And so Jesus is inviting us into something far deeper. He's inviting us into something more profound and something spiritually richer than just an institution. He's inviting us into presence. And his first call for us, he calls us to obey his commands, right? Which are what? Love God, love others and ourselves, and treat people how we want to be treated, right? And then if you look at us doing that, that leads to this word abide that he says over and over. In some translations, it says the word remain. In the Greek, it's the word meno, and it carries with it a myriad of pictures, but one of the most significant is the idea of continuing to be present, to continue to be present. And I think one of the reasons that this is so significant is because you don't need the church to be present. You don't need the church to have presence or to continue to be present. You don't need the institution to do those things. And that terrifies the American church. Which is why all the programs, right? All the programs that you have to attend, and the fear and the wrath and manipulation. Hear me when I say this, Shift. You don't need us to do this. How many of you came out of evangelical places where they kept you so busy? Where you had like Sunday schools and Sunday mornings, and on the Sunday morning service, it was always work one, serve one, worship one. Anybody remember that? And then you had Sunday night stuff, and then there were youth groups, and then there were, if you were involved in anything, you had meetings, and then there were rehearsals of different kinds. And then not only youth group, but then you had youth group outings and then youth group service projects. And then if you were a deacon or an elder or a team leader of some kind, there were always extra nights too. And then you would look up, and some weeks you have been up at the church like 5 nights. And it's all designed. And I'm not talking about people's hearts. I think that a lot of these things happen with good intentions, but the way it was designed kept us so busy that we felt like we were doing that inner work because we were constantly in spaces that were reaffirming that made us feel certain ways, right? But you never have the time to actually stop and do that inner work, which is why I am convinced that when the shutdown occurred and everybody had a moment to breathe and look around, so many things fundamentally changed. Jobs were quit. Habits, attendance habits, which is all they were in the church, stopped, and people woke up and realized, oh, that's just not healthy. I'm not going back to that. And the church freaked out and panicked because, oh my God, all these people are leaving. How are we going to keep the doors open? And yet never thought about this passage of maybe that limb needed to be pruned. Maybe that limb isn't producing fruit. You don't need Shift to have presence. Can it help? Yes, 100%, right? Of course, it is super beneficial to have a group of like-minded people all working towards the same thing in almost any area of life. Like, it's just nice to have a group of people that are pursuing the same things. It helps. Absolutely, it does. And Shift is here to help you find that kind of community and spiritual guidance, but you don't need Shift to do that. To have presence does not require you to attend this gathering. Helpful? Yes. Needed at times? Yes. Required? Absolutely not. I know I can name off people right now. I know people who practice this kind of presence, who are dialed into that vine and branches kind of thinking without being able to step foot into a church space. And I can almost guarantee you that if you've been in church in your life, you have probably never heard that taught. The practice of presence or abiding or remaining in Christ is inner work. It's recognizing and observing that unchecked ego. And this is what it means to die to ourselves. That's what it means to pick up your cross, to lose our lives to find it. Paul called the ego the flesh or the sarx, those animal appetites. And this is what many in the New Testament refer to as the sin nature or old man. It's the ego, the unobserved ego. And this is why we have begun starting and ending all of our gatherings with a moment of observation and reflection. Because if we are present to ourselves, we will observe the ego. And once observed, it no longer has the power over our lives it once did. In the words of Christian mystic Thomas Merton and Trappist monk, true Christianity is growth in the life of the spirit, a deepening of new life, a continuous rebirth in which the exterior and superficial life of the ego self is discarded like an old snakeskin, and the mysterious invisible self of the spirit becomes more present and more active. The true Christian rebirth is a renewed transformation, a Passover, in which a person is progressively liberated from selfishness and not only grows in love, but in some sense becomes love. The perfection of the new birth is reached where there is no more selfishness, there is only love. In the language of the mystics, there is no more ego self, there is only Christ. Self no longer acts, only the spirit acts in pure love. The perfect illumination is then the illumination of love shining by itself. To become completely transparent and allow love to shine by itself is the maturity of the new man. To continue to be present is to observe the ego, to lose your life, to find it. This is where that constant barrage of news or church programs really hinders the work, because to be present takes time and intention. And you will have to create new habits. And creating new habits is like uprooting an old oak tree and in its place planting a new seedling. You have to spend so much time caring for that seedling daily. Otherwise, it just withers and dies. Time and intention. Fortunately, all you need to do that are just little changes plus time. If you were in LA, this is how little you need. If you were in Los Angeles and you were flying to New York City, and the pilot leaving LAX adjusted that flight path by 3.5 degrees or between 86 and 92 inches, you would end up 225 miles away in Washington, D.C. An almost imperceptible change given time reroutes your trajectory and your destination. And so to end today, I would like to end with a few small changes that I think can help all of us in our journey to presence. Can you go and show that first one? Start your day with grounding. Do something that centers you to begin your day. For some, that's going to look like a devotion, right? Like a prayer time. For others, it's going outside, standing in the grass barefoot. For me, it's this Celtic book of benedictions and coffee and solitude. You might have to set your alarm 5 minutes earlier, but start your day with something that centers or grounds you. Start the day with stepping outside of yourself to check that ego. Number 2, take care of yourself. Doing something that's beneficial to you and to your body, to your spirit, something that you enjoy. Work out, take a walk, paint, read a book, be with people, right? You just need to take care of yourself. You cannot do the difficult task of this inner work with a dry well. And the truth is that you may already be doing some of these things. Just start doing them with intention. Like, know the why behind why you're doing them. Number 3, Commit to seeing divine patterns. Once you commit to looking for God everywhere, your brain will automatically recognize it. It's called reticular activation. It's a thing that your brain does. It's like when you go by a red car and then all of a sudden you just notice these red cars everywhere, right? They were always there, but your brain just didn't see them. It's the same thing. God is already everywhere and in everyone, but just commit to seeing it. And last, give yourself some grace. This is a lifelong practice. This is what it means of when Paul says we're being saved, of working out our salvation. It is a lifelong practice, and it won't always be easy. Like when I first started meditating, I was terrible, awful. I'm not great now, but I'm better. So don't beat yourself up, especially at the beginning when everything is difficult. Just remember that like almost an imperceptible change, small change given time changes your trajectory and your destination. And I'll say this, that observing your ego doesn't make everything magically easier. In fact, I think it makes it harder in many ways. And I think that's why Jesus said that the wide gate is easy and the narrow gate is hard. Because once your eyes are opened, once your understanding is illuminated with truth, you realize that you have to continually choose the narrow gate. And you won't always do it. You won't always continue to be present. Sometimes you will type out that message and hit send before you choose to be present. Sometimes someone will cut you off at work and you won't be present, and you will use sign language to tell them that they are number one. But because of the practice of observing and checking that ego, right? The practice of presence, it will be easier to get back onto that path. It will be easier to choose that path without all of the shame that comes from our old altar calls. And I don't say this melodramatically. I think our country is headed for something really bad. I think our country is headed for a train wreck. And I also think that the evangelical church is helping drive that train. And if we are to avert the destructions that humans seem to choose again and again and again, it's going to be because someone offers hope, like real hope. It's going to be because everyday normal people in pockets of resistance just like this all over the country choose a better way. American Jesus is going to try and distract you, bombard you with fear and news. It's going to try to entertain you, keep you occupied with endless programs. Because if you're distracted enough, you will never get to the important work. You might show up in places that make you feel like you're doing that work, but you will never get below the surface to do the real work of dying to self. And so don't let the busyness of our news cycle keep you from presence. Unplug, turn off the TV, stop watching your news. For the love of everything holy, stop watching your news. This one's for free. My son, when he was younger, loved the WWE. We have been to WrestleMania, we've been to Raw, SmackDown, the tapings, we've been to all of it. All right. We have seen Stone Cold Austin in person, which was amazing. Okay. Which was amazing. And I've said this before, but their whole job is to get a reaction out of you. That's the job, is to make you feel like you're part of the show. That's literally, and they are good at it, right? They know their audience. And it's sports entertainment, right? It's a predicted outcome. It's already set up. Super athletic, right? Like I couldn't do those things. Super athletic. They still know how it's going to end. Fox, CNN, MSNBC, they're all news entertainment. There is a predicted outcome and they know their audience, and the purpose is to get a reaction out of you so that you buy their product. Stop watching your news. Don't let the busyness and the fear from those news cycles keep you from presence. when we're plugged into the divine presence that is already and always there, we'll begin to see the world and each other differently. Presence is how we choose to love our neighbors as ourselves. Presence is how we overcome. Presence is what gives us hope. And just like Jyn Erso said in my favorite Star Wars movie, Rogue One, rebellions are built on hope. And we will talk more about that next week. If you're new, we end each gathering with a time of reflection, and we do that to allow you the time to listen to your body and to listen to the Spirit, to practice presence. And the band, they will come up and play, so it's not an awkward silence. Lights will be turned down to help create intimacy. And I will ask a few questions to guide that process. And then I'll pray. And we will have a time for any that are willing to take communion, which are those little cups in your seats. And each week we reflect on what we've heard and learned, talked about. And today, let it remind us, let these little symbols remind us of presence. The divine presence that is always there, always surrounding us, even in this moment. Just be aware of it. So in the same way we began our gathering, if you're comfortable, close your eyes and take a few deep cleansing breaths. In through the nose and then out slowly through the mouth. And center yourself here in the now, practicing presence. What was it that you needed from me today? From this gathering? What was your intention that you set at the beginning? Did it come to you today? And if so, what's it saying to you? If it didn't come today, why do you think that? And then what is that saying? Does the weariness of our current culture drain you? Can you feel that? And do you do anything that recharges you? If so, what is it? And if not, then why not? Which of these small steps, those 4 small steps that I listed, which of those small steps I listed can help you practice presence the best? Which one of those resonated with you the most? And how can you implement that today? And my final question is, will you commit to seeing the divine presence everywhere, even within yourself? And how will you do that? Allow me to offer any help to any of you that need it, whether it be a conversation over coffee or helping start a habit or whatever. And you can just find me after the service or reach out during the week. Let's pray. Divine Presence, we thank you for surrounding us, for moving through us. I pray that we learn to see you everywhere and in everyone, God, through all and in all. In you, we have our being. And so give us opportunities to practice daily presence with you and with ourselves and with others. And maybe most importantly, those we disagree with. I ask that Shift always be a true third way, a place of higher consciousness, a Christ consciousness. And I pray for the continued death of Christendom and that a truer, holier, and more sacred way of being takes its place. I pray that we're part of that next chapter. And I pray true peace over our country. I pray against the structures and imperial powers that govern from dark places. May your light shine in those dark places. Forgive us for things done and for things left undone. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear. Bring comfort to the afflicted, healing to the broken, and freedom to the chained. In your name, amen.